Upper Platte Country, 1839. At 5:10 in the morning, Lars Jensen's thermometer reads 63 degrees, while his neighbor's cabins sit at 38 degrees. Outside it's 6 below zero, with a 30-mile-per-hour norther cutting across the settlement. The difference? Yesterday afternoon, he dug a trench 14 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 14 feet long straight down the center of his cabin floor. He filled it with river stones and burned a roaring fire for 5 hours until the rocks glowed orange. Then he did something that made his neighbors call him a fool. He shoveled out every live coal and buried the whole thing under 6 inches of dirt. Ephraim Bolton, who sold box stoves at the trading post, couldn't believe anyone would smother a perfectly good fire in filth. Yellow Willow, the Arapaho elder who taught him the technique from earth oven cooking, just smiled. Standard cabins burned through 6 to 8 armloads of wood every day and still froze by dawn. But Jensen's dirt floor radiated steady heat all night without a single stick of wood. Then came the 3-night cold snap, 15 to 25 below with howling wind, and a fuel shortage when the supply sleds couldn't get through. Jensen's neighbors watched their thin-walled shanties drop to the 30s, while his floor stayed a steady 74 degrees. What ancient principle of heat storage had he learned that everyone else dismissed as primitive? And how did burying his fire become the key to cutting his wood use in half while keeping his cabin 24 degrees warmer? If stories of practical frontier wisdom that stood the test of time interest you, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented techniques worth remembering. The spirit thermometer hanging from the roof beam of Lars Jensen's cabin read 63 degrees Fahrenheit at 5:10 on a February morning in 1839. Outside, the wind howled across the Upper Platte settlement at 30 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to 6 below zero. Jensen rolled out of his bunk and placed his bare feet on the dirt floor. It was warm, 74 degrees at the center line where yesterday he had buried his fire under 6 inches of soil. 200 yards away, in the thin-walled shanties that dotted the rest of the settlement, his neighbors were waking to rooms that barely held 38 degrees despite box stoves that had burned all night. The difference lay in what Jensen had done the afternoon before and what every settler in the territory thought was the act of a madman. At 2 o'clock, he had taken a long-handled shovel and dug a trench straight down the center of his cabin floor. 14 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 14 feet long, dimensions he had measured carefully with a knotted cord. The excavated soil sat in neat piles beside his door, waiting. He lined the trench with river stones, each one the size of a fist or larger, carefully selected from the creek bed where the water had rounded them smooth over countless seasons. Dense granite and basalt, never the layered sandstone that could split when heated. By his estimate, he had placed nearly 700 pounds of rock in that narrow channel. Then came the part that made Ephraim Bolton shake his head in disgust. Bolton ran the settlement's hardware counter, selling box stoves and stovepipe to immigrants heading west. He had watched Jensen build his fire, not the careful banked burn that settlers used to stretch their fuel through the night, but a roaring, wasteful blaze that consumed split pine and oak at a rate that made Bolton wince. For 5 straight hours, Jensen fed that fire until the rocks glowed orange in the trench and heat shimmered above the cabin floor like summer air over prairie grass. The temperature in those stone voids reached 900 degrees, hot enough that Jensen had to step back when he opened the door. "You're burning a week's worth of wood in one afternoon," Bolton had called from the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air. "And for what? To heat rocks you're going to bury like some Indian doing cookery in a pit." Bolton's knowledge came from trade circulars and emigrant guides that preached the wisdom of steady, economical burns. Keep the stove ticking all night, they said. Steady flame meant steady comfort. What Jensen was doing violated every principle of fuel conservation that the frontier had taught them. But Jensen had learned his technique from Yellow Willow, the Arapaho elder who camped near the settlement each winter. She had shown him how her people heated stone-lined pits for cooking roots and meat, charging the rocks with intense heat, then sealing them under earth to hold that energy for hours after the flames died. The principle was simple: separate the burn from the benefit. Make the fire clean and hot, then store the heat in mass that would release it slowly through the night. At 6:30, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Jensen had done the thing that convinced his neighbors he had lost his mind. He raked every live coal, every glowing ember, out of the trench and into a metal bucket. The rocks still radiated heat that made the air dance, but there was no open flame, no smoldering wood left behind. He opened the ridge vent for 15 minutes, letting the draft clear any lingering smoke, then began shoveling the excavated soil back into the trench. 6 inches of dry earth, tamped down firm, sealing the heat inside like a lid on a pot. "You just smothered your fire in filth," Bolton had said, standing in the doorway with 2 other settlers who had come to watch the spectacle. "Tomorrow morning you'll wake up cold as the rest of us, and you'll have wasted a day's worth of fuel doing it." Jensen had simply closed the vent and swept the loose soil from his floor. By 8 o'clock, the surface temperature at the center of the cabin was 76 degrees. By midnight, it had settled to 72. At dawn, when Bolton's stove had burned down to coals and his cabin temperature had dropped to the high 30s, Jensen's floor was still radiating steady warmth at 68 degrees. The mockery had started even before Jensen finished his first trench. Margaret Cafferty, the Irish widow trying to keep her 2 children warm in a plank cabin, had shaken her head when she saw him digging. "There's easier ways to heat a room than turning your floor into a graveyard for good firewood," she had said. Patrick O'Rourke, the canal hand-turned-sod farmer, had been more direct. "Man digs up his own floor and calls it improvement. Next thing he'll be telling us to sleep in the barn because it's warmer than the house." Even Baptiste Gervais, the French-Canadian trapper who understood the value of heating rocks for camp cooking, had initially been skeptical of the indoor application. "Stone heat works fine by a creek when you're boiling water," he had told the gathered settlers. "But sealing it under a cabin floor? That's asking for trouble. Smoke, steam, maybe the whole place catching fire from below." Only after Jensen demonstrated the coal removal protocol and the safety of the earth cap had Gervais begun to nod his approval. The settlement's opinion setters had been unanimous in their dismissal. Johannes Schmidt, the German wheelwright who repaired sleds and made stove elbows, had calculated the fuel waste with typical precision. 5 hours of hard-burning uses what most of us stretch across 3 days, he had announced to anyone who would listen. "It's mathematics. You cannot improve efficiency by burning more wood, not less." Sarah McKendrick, the schoolteacher who kept weather records in a neat journal, had noted the experiment with skeptical curiosity, but predicted it would prove nothing more than an expensive way to heat dirt. The vindication would come soon enough. But for now, on that February morning with the wind screaming across the settlement and the temperature plunging toward what would become a 3-day siege of Arctic cold, Lars Jensen simply enjoyed the warmth rising through the soles of his feet and wondered how long it would take his neighbors to stop calling him a fool and start asking how deep to dig their trenches. The heat stored in 700 pounds of stone and sealed under 6 inches of earth was just beginning to prove its worth. Outside, the real test was building on the northern horizon, a wall of clouds that would drop the temperature to 25 below zero and strand the settlement without a fuel delivery for nearly a week. To understand what Lars Jensen had accomplished in his dirt-floored cabin, Yellow Willow drew diagrams in the packed earth outside her lodge. She used a pointed stick to sketch circles representing stones, with arrows showing how heat moved from fire into rock, then from rock into the surrounding soil, then upward through the earth cap to warm the air above. The physics she demonstrated were the same principles that governed the great masonry heaters of northern Europe, those massive stone stoves that frontier settlers fired hard once or twice a day, then allowed to coast on stored thermal mass for 12 to 24 hours. The system worked as a heat battery, charging rapidly during the intense afternoon burn, then discharging slowly through the long winter night. During Jensen's 5-hour firing, the granite and basalt stones absorbed energy at temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit. The rocks themselves became the fuel storage medium, holding British thermal units in their crystalline structure the way a blacksmith's forge holds heat in its fire brick lining. When the flames died and the earth cap went on, that stored energy had nowhere to go but up. Through 6 inches of tamped soil, that acted as both insulation and heat distributor, spreading the warmth laterally across the cabin floor. Baptiste Gervais, who had heated rocks for camp cooking across 2 decades of Rocky Mountain winters, understood the principle from practical experience. Hot stone in water made tea. Hot stone wrapped in buffalo hide dried wet moccasins. Hot stone buried in coals roasted meat through the night without burning. The innovation Jensen had made was architectural, taking the portable heat storage concept and building it permanently into the foundation of a living space. The trench became a horizontal masonry heater lying beneath the floor instead of standing against the wall. Yellow Willow's people had used earth ovens for generations beyond memory, and she explained the technique with the patience of someone teaching children to walk. Stone selection mattered critically: dense, fine-grained rock from moving water, granite, basalt, quartzite, absorbed and held heat without fracturing. Layered stones like sandstone or limestone could split explosively when heated rapidly, sending razor-sharp fragments across a room. Wet stones were equally dangerous, expanding their trapped moisture into steam that could crack rock like winter, freezing burst water barrels. Jensen selected every stone individually from the creek bed, looking for the rounded, water-polished specimens that had already survived countless freeze-thaw cycles. The mass calculation was equally precise. 700 pounds of stone provided enough thermal storage to heat a 12 by 16-foot cabin through a February night. Too little mass and the system exhausted itself by midnight. Too much mass and the daily firing couldn't charge the full bed to useful temperature. Jensen had learned the ratio through trial and error during his first winter attempts, measuring cordwood consumption against morning floor temperatures until he found the sweet spot that balanced charging time with heat duration. The burn profile required discipline that violated every frontier instinct about fuel conservation. Most settlers banked their fires at sunset, damping the draft to stretch glowing coals through the night in a slow, smoky burn that conserved wood but filled cabins with eye-watering smoke and left them cold by dawn. Jensen's method demanded the opposite: an open, roaring fire that consumed split oak and pine at a rate that seemed wasteful to anyone watching. But the efficiency came in the storage, not the burning. A clean, hot fire at 900 degrees transferred more energy into stone in 5 hours than a smoldering fire could deliver in 15. Johannes Schmidt, the German craftsman whose forge experience taught him to read heat by color, helped Jensen refine the firing technique. The stones glowed dull red at 600 degrees, bright orange at 800, and yellow-white approaching 1000. The target was sustained orange, hot enough for maximum energy transfer, not so hot that it cracked the stone or created dangerous conditions inside a wooden building. Schmidt timed each phase with an hourglass, noting that the first hour brought the bed up to charging temperature, while the final 4 hours delivered the bulk of the stored energy. Coal removal was the critical safety step that separated Jensen's system from the dangerous practice of banking fires overnight. Every glowing ember, every piece of smoldering charcoal came out of the trench before the earth cap went on. This eliminated the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning from incomplete combustion under the soil layer. Schmidt fashioned a long-handled rake specifically for the purpose, designed to scrape the trench clean while keeping the operator away from the radiant heat. The removed coals went into a metal bucket, then outside to a safe ash pit where they could burn out harmlessly. The cap layer served multiple functions that became obvious only after watching the system operate. 6 inches of dry, tamped earth provided thermal insulation that prevented rapid heat loss while allowing steady upward conduction. The soil also distributed the point sources of heat from individual stones into an even temperature gradient across the cabin floor. Too thin a cap and the floor developed hot spots directly above the largest rocks. Too thick a cap and the heat took too long to reach the surface, wasting energy in the surrounding earth instead of warming the living space. Ventilation timing completed the safety protocol. The small ridge vent remained open during the entire firing, creating a draft that pulled combustion gases up and out of the cabin. After coal removal, Jensen allowed 10 to 15 minutes for the draft to clear any lingering smoke before closing the vent and sealing the earth cap. This prevented backdraft or gas accumulation while ensuring that the stored heat stayed in the thermal mass instead of escaping up the chimney. Sarah McKendrick, who measured everything she could with the instruments available to a frontier schoolteacher, documented the temperature progression with a spirit thermometer. At capping time, the floor surface read 92 degrees directly above the stone bed. By 10 o'clock in the evening, it had settled to 78 degrees. At midnight, 74 degrees. By 2 in the morning, 71 degrees. At dawn, 66 degrees, still warm enough to walk on barefoot when the outdoor temperature stood at 15 below zero. The system echoed heat storage techniques from around the world, each adapted to local materials and climate demands. Korean Ondol systems ran heated flues under stone floors, using the same principle of separating combustion from heat delivery. Scandinavian Kachelofan and Finnish contraflow heaters charge massive stone cores with intense fires, then radiated stored heat for 18 to 20 hours. Russian brick stoves followed similar principles, storing the day's fuel energy and masonry that released warmth through the following night. Jensen had independently rediscovered what human beings had learned wherever winters were long and fuel was precious, that thermal mass could stretch fire energy across time, providing steady warmth long after the flames died. The Arctic front stalled over the Upper Platte on February 14, 1839, bringing with it the kind of cold that killed cattle in their stalls and froze whiskey solid in the bottle. Sarah McKendrick recorded the temperature drop in her weather journal with the precision of someone who understood that numbers told stories better than words. At sunset on the 13th, her thermometer read 8 below zero. By midnight, it had fallen to 18 below. At dawn on the 14th, 23 below zero with a wind that drove powdered snow through the gaps in even well-chinked log walls. The supply sleds that should have delivered cordwood from the timber camps to the south had turned back 50 miles out when the lead driver lost feeling in his hands and feet. Word reached the settlement through a lone rider who barely made it through the drifts. No fuel deliveries for at least a week, maybe longer if the cold held. Every family began counting their wood piles with the arithmetic of survival. At normal consumption rates, most households carried enough split wood for 10 days of moderate cold. But this was not moderate cold, and the wind made it worse. Ephraim Bolton's hardware store became the center of worried calculation as neighbors gathered to share information and compare their fuel supplies. Bolton himself burned through 12 armloads of wood in the first 24 hours, feeding his box stove every 2 hours through the night to keep his plank-walled store from freezing. The thin boards that made up most of the settlement's buildings provided little insulation against wind that cut through gaps and drove cold air into every corner. Even with continuous burning, Bolton's morning temperatures rarely climbed above 40 degrees, and by dawn they had dropped to the mid-30s. Margaret Cafferty faced the mathematics of disaster in her cabin with 2 children under 10 years old. Her husband had died the previous summer, leaving her with a woodpile that had seemed adequate for 1 adult and 2 small bodies. But children's metabolisms ran hot, and they needed steady warmth to avoid the lung sickness that killed frontier families when their resistance dropped. She burned wood frantically the first night, feeding split pine into her stove until the metal glowed red. Even so, her cabin temperature never climbed above 45 degrees, and she could see her breath when she checked on the children at 3 in the morning. Patrick O'Rourke, the former canal hand who kept careful records of everything that cost money, calculated his wood consumption with the grim precision of someone who understood that mathematics determined who lived and who died on the frontier. His normal winter burn rate was 3 armloads per day in moderate cold. During the first night of the deep freeze, he burned 8 armloads and still woke to find frost on the inside of his cabin walls. At that rate, his woodpile would last 4 more days. After that, he would be burning furniture, then floorboards, then whatever he could scavenge before the cold claimed his family. Johannes Schmidt approached the fuel crisis with the methodical thinking that had made him successful as a craftsman. He had insulated his cabin better than most, using oakum and clay chinking between the logs. But even his careful construction could not overcome the basic mathematics of heat loss. His forge experience taught him that metal conducted cold as efficiently as it conducted heat, and his stovepipe became a highway for frigid air that poured down into his living space every time the wind gusted. He tried damping the stove to stretch his fuel, but the smoky, oxygen-starved burn filled his cabin with eye-watering smoke while barely maintaining temperature above freezing. Lars Jensen followed his established routine as if the crisis did not exist. At 2 o'clock on February 14th, he lit his charging fire in the stone-lined trench beneath his cabin floor. For 5 hours, he fed split oak and pine into the roaring blaze, consuming what his neighbors calculated as a full day's worth of fuel in a single afternoon. The rocks heated to their familiar orange glow, the air above the trench shimmered with radiant energy, and at 6:30 he raked out every coal and ember before capping the bed with 6 inches of tamped earth. By 8 o'clock that evening, when his neighbors were feeding their second armload of the day into stoves that barely held the cold at bay, Jensen's cabin floor registered 76 degrees. The radiant heat rising from the buried thermal mass warmed the air to a steady 62 degrees, comfortable enough that he could work at his table without gloves or extra clothing. Outside, the wind howled at 35 miles per hour and drove him, the temperature down to 25 below zero. The contrast became impossible to ignore when Baptiste Gervais knocked on Jensen's door at midnight, stamping his feet and blowing on his hands after checking on the settlement's livestock. Inside his own cabin, the veteran trapper had burned 6 armloads of wood since sunset and still found ice forming on his water bucket. Jensen's cabin felt like summer by comparison, the floor warm underfoot and the air heated to a temperature that allowed normal conversation without visible breath. Margaret Cafferty brought her children to Jensen's cabin on the second night when her own stove began to smoke badly from desperate overfiring. Her woodpile had shrunk to a 3-day supply, and the children were coughing from the cold air they breathed while sleeping. Jensen spread buffalo robes on his warm floor, and for the first time in 2 days, the children stopped shivering. The steady, radiant heat from the buried stones warmed their bodies from below, while the heated air provided comfortable breathing. Cafferty herself slept better that night than she had since her husband's death. The constant worry about fuel temporarily lifted. Patrick O'Rourke arrived on the 3rd morning with his ledger in hand, ready to document exactly how Jensen's system compared to conventional heating. The numbers told a story that overturned everything the settlement believed about fuel efficiency. In 3 days of extreme cold, Jensen had burned approximately 1/6 of a cord of wood, all of it consumed during his daily charging fires. His neighbors had burned nearly half a cord each, feeding their stoves continuously through 3 days and nights of desperate heating. Yet Jensen's cabin maintained dawn temperatures in the low 60s, while theirs dropped to the mid-30s despite constant fuel consumption. The safety advantage became equally obvious. Jensen's system produced no overnight smoke because there was no overnight fire. The combustion was complete, the coals removed, and the heat stored in stone and earth. His neighbors, desperately damping their stoves to stretch fuel, filled their cabins with partially burned gases that made breathing difficult and sleep fitful. Several children developed the harsh cough that signaled lung irritation from smoke inhalation, while Jensen's cabin remained clear and comfortable. By the 4th day, with no sign of the cold breaking and no fuel deliveries in sight, 3 more families had moved into Jensen's cabin, sleeping on the warm floor that never dropped below 65 degrees. The man they had called a fool for burying his fire in dirt had become the center of the settlement's survival strategy. His thermal mass system, the only heating method that could sustain life without consuming wood faster than it could be gathered from the surrounding forest. Johannes Schmidt approached documentation with the same precision he brought to wheelwright work, measuring twice and cutting once. On February 15th, he began keeping a fuel and temperature ledger that would settle the question of Jensen's heating method once and for all. Schmidt understood that frontier arguments were won with numbers, not opinions, and he had the instruments and discipline to gather data that skeptics could not dismiss. Each morning at dawn, Schmidt visited every cabin in the settlement with his spirit thermometer, recording air temperatures at floor level and head height. He measured the cordwood consumption by counting armloads and converting them to fractional cord equivalents using notches he carved on a measuring stick. Every evening, he recorded the day's wood burn, the overnight temperature maintenance, and any operational problems that affected heating efficiency. What emerged over 10 days of systematic measurement was a mathematical proof that overturned conventional wisdom about frontier heating. Jensen's daily routine never varied. At 2 o'clock each afternoon, he lit his charging fire in the stone-lined trench, feeding split oak and pine in a roaring burn that consumed approximately 1/8 cord of wood in 5 hours. Schmidt timed each phase with an hourglass borrowed from Sarah McKendrick, noting that Jensen achieved sustained orange heat in the rock bed by the end of the first hour, then maintained that intensity through 4 more hours of continuous feeding. At 6:30, Jensen raked out every coal and ember, allowed 15 minutes for the draft to clear, then capped the trench with 6 inches of tamped earth. The temperature measurements revealed the system's extraordinary efficiency. At capping time, Schmidt's thermometer read 90 degrees directly above the stone bed. By 10 o'clock evening, the floor temperature had stabilized at 76 degrees. At midnight, 72 degrees. By 3 in the morning, 68 degrees. At dawn, the floor still radiated heat at 64 degrees, providing comfortable foot warmth when outdoor temperatures stood at 18 below zero. Air temperature measurements showed equally impressive results. Jensen's cabin maintained 61 degrees at dawn, measured 4 feet above the floor in the center of the room. His neighbors' cabins, despite continuous burning through the night, averaged 39 degrees at dawn. The difference was consistent across 10 days of measurement. Jensen's cabin stayed 22 degrees warmer, with no overnight fuel consumption, while his neighbors burned wood continuously and still faced near-freezing conditions by morning. The fuel accounting produced numbers that challenged everything the settlement believed about heating efficiency. Over 10 days of extreme cold, Jensen consumed 1 3/4 cords of wood. His neighbors, burning continuously with their box stoves, used an average of 4 cords each over the same period. Schmidt calculated the efficiency difference at 57%. Jensen achieved superior heating while using less than half the fuel of conventional methods. Patrick O'Rourke, who had moved his family into Jensen's cabin during the worst of the cold snap, kept his own parallel records focused on the practical details that mattered to someone stretching limited resources. He documented the daily wood gathering required to support each heating method, noting that Jensen's system required 2 hours of splitting and stacking each afternoon to support the high-intensity burn. Conventional heating demanded continuous wood processing, splitting kindling every few hours, banking coals, and maintaining steady fuel flow that interrupted sleep and daily work. Margaret Cafferty contributed observations from a perspective that Schmidt's thermometer could not capture. Her children stopped coughing within 2 days of sleeping on Jensen's warm floor, their breathing clearing as the heated air eliminated the lung irritation caused by smoke inhalation in poorly ventilated cabins. The steady radiant heat from below warmed their bodies more effectively than the convective heat from box stoves, which created hot zones near the fire and cold zones in corners and along walls. The safety advantages became equally measurable. Schmidt recorded 0 instances of smoke accumulation in Jensen's cabin because the combustion was complete and the coals removed before the earth cap sealed the system. His neighbors' cabins, where desperate fuel conservation led to damped stoves and incomplete burns, showed measurable smoke density that caused eye irritation and breathing problems. 3 children in conventional cabins developed severe coughs during the cold snap. None of the children sleeping in Jensen's cabin showed any respiratory symptoms. Schmidt also documented the failure modes that validated Jensen's careful technique. When a newcomer named William Hayes attempted to copy the system using wet river stones, the results were spectacular and dangerous. The trapped moisture expanded into steam as the rocks heated, causing several stones to explode with sharp cracks that sent fragments across his cabin. Hayes abandoned the attempt after the first failure, but Schmidt noted the importance of stone selection and gradual preheating for wet specimens. Another settler, Thomas Kellner, tried to shortcut the coal removal process by capping his trench, while embers still glowed beneath the surface. Within hours, smoke began seeping through the earth cap, and by morning his cabin reeked of carbon monoxide. Kellner woke with the headache and nausea that signaled dangerous gas accumulation. Only after adopting Jensen's strict protocol, complete coal removal, and 15 minutes of draft clearing did Kellner achieve safe operation. The moisture control benefits showed up in Schmidt's detailed observations of cabin conditions. Jensen's heated floor eliminated the condensation that plagued thin-walled buildings during extreme cold. His neighbors found frost forming behind furniture and along interior walls where cold air infiltration met warm, humid air from cooking and breathing. Jensen's cabin remained dry and comfortable, the radiant floor heat preventing the temperature differentials that caused moisture problems. Sarah McKendrick added external validation by researching similar heating systems in her collection of agricultural publications and emigrant guides. She found references to ondol floor heating in Korea, where heated flues under stone floors provided household warmth using the same principle of separating combustion from heat delivery. Her notes also mentioned masonry heaters in northern European countries, massive stone stoves that stored heat from intense daily fires, and radiated warmth for 12 to 24 hours. The archaeological perspective came from Yellow Willow, who explained that earth oven features were common across North American indigenous cultures wherever winters required long-term heat storage. Fire-cracked rock and charcoal lenses in the archaeological record showed that the technique had been refined over centuries. The frontier application was simply an architectural adaptation of proven thermal mass principles. By the end of 10 days, Schmidt's ledger contained irrefutable evidence that Jensen's floor heating system delivered superior performance while consuming dramatically less fuel. The measurements showed consistent temperature advantages, documented fuel savings, and proven safety benefits. More importantly, the system had kept 8 people alive and comfortable during a cold snap that pushed conventional heating methods to their breaking point. The man they had mocked for burying his fire in dirt had demonstrated the mathematical superiority of thermal mass heating over continuous combustion. The transformation began on the third night of the cold snap, when Margaret Cafferty knocked on Jensen's door with her 2 children wrapped in every blanket she owned. Her own cabin had dropped to 28 degrees despite burning her last armload of split wood, and she faced the choice between freezing or swallowing her pride. Jensen spread buffalo robes on his warm floor without a word, and within an hour both children had stopped shivering for the first time in 3 days. By morning, when the outdoor temperature reached 27 below zero, the children were sleeping peacefully on a floor that maintained 66 degrees of steady, radiant heat. Patrick O'Rourke arrived the following afternoon with his ledger, a shovel, and a request that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He wanted Jensen to teach him how to dig his own trench system, and he was willing to pay for the instruction with labor and a share of his stored vegetables. O'Rourke had calculated that his current wood consumption would exhaust his fuel supply in 4 more days, while Jensen's method could stretch the same wood through 3 weeks of extreme cold. The mathematics of survival had converted the skeptic into a student. Within a week of the cold snap's end, 3 more cabins in the settlement showed the telltale signs of floor excavation. Johannes Schmidt had traded his wheelwright services for help digging a trench 12 inches wide, 14 inches deep, and 16 feet long down the center of his cabin. Baptist Gervais used his trapping connections to locate the best river stones, gathering nearly 1,000 pounds of dense granite from a creek bed 10 miles upstream. Sarah McKendrick documented each installation with her characteristic precision, recording trench dimensions, stone quantities, and the charging schedules that each family developed. The adoption process revealed refinements that improved on Jensen's original technique. Schmidt, with his craftsman's eye for structural problems, noticed that the earth walls of the trenches tended to slough soil into the stone bed during the heating and cooling cycles. He solved the problem by building wooden cribs, slat frameworks that held the trench walls stable while allowing heat transfer through the gaps. The cribs added an hour to the installation process, but prevented the gradual collapse that could reduce heating efficiency over time. O'Rourke discovered that a thin layer of clay and sand over the earth cap made floor maintenance significantly easier. The mixture swept clean with a broom and provided a more even heat distribution than raw soil, which developed ridges and valleys that created uncomfortable hot spots. His clay sand skim was only half an inch thick, enough to improve the surface without interfering with heat transfer from the buried stones. Margaret Cafferty contributed the insight that loose rugs placed over the hottest sections of the floor allowed fine-tuning of the radiant heat for sleeping comfort. Children, with their higher metabolic rates, could sleep comfortably on the cooler edges of the floor, while adults appreciated the direct warmth at the center line where the stone bed ran deepest. The rugs also protected bare feet from occasional hot spots that developed directly above the largest stones. Ephraim Bolton, who had been the most vocal critic of Jensen's methods, became an unlikely convert when his hardware store faced a fuel crisis during a late February blizzard that trapped the settlement for 5 more days. Rather than burn his inventory of wooden handles and toolboxes, Bolton hired Schmidt to install a trench system in his store. Within 2 days, he was maintaining comfortable shopping temperatures while using 60% less wood than his previous heating methods. The technique spread beyond the original settlement as word traveled along the immigrant routes that connected frontier communities. Thomas Beeman, a road overseer who traveled between settlements inspecting bridges and culverts, documented the floor heating systems in his reports to county commissioners. He noted that the method worked particularly well in areas where timber was scarce, allowing families to maintain comfortable cabins without depleting local forests or depending on expensive fuel deliveries. Beeman's documentation included technical specifications that standardized the installation process for other communities. Trenches should measure 12 to 16 inches wide and 10 to 14 inches deep, with length proportional to cabin size, approximately 1 foot of trench per 10 square feet of floor area. Stone quantity should target 700 to 1,000 pounds of dense, water-smoothed rock. Daily charging fires should burn for 4 to 5 hours at sustained orange heat, with complete coal removal before capping with 6 inches of dry, tamped earth. Yellow Willow, whose earth oven knowledge had inspired Jensen's original experiment, watched the adoption process with the satisfaction of someone seeing ancient wisdom validated by practical results. She continued to camp near the settlement each winter, and settlers began seeking her advice on stone selection, firing techniques, and the seasonal timing that optimized thermal mass systems. Her knowledge became part of the settlement's collective expertise, bridging indigenous practice with frontier necessity. Sarah McKendrick's weather records documented the long-term effects of the floor heating systems on community survival and comfort. During the winter of 1841, when another severe cold snap brought temperatures to 30 below zero for 8 consecutive days, the settlement experienced no cases of frostbite, no fuel shortages, and no deaths from cold-related illness. The contrast with previous winters, when similar cold snaps had claimed lives and forced families to burn furniture and floorboards, demonstrated the life-saving potential of thermal mass heating. The technique evolved as it spread, with different communities adapting the basic principle to local materials and conditions. In areas with limestone bedrock, settlers learned to line their trenches with fired clay to prevent the alkaline stone from affecting floor soil chemistry. Communities with limited wood supply developed hybrid systems that combined small daily fires with passive solar heating, using the thermal mass to store warmth from south-facing windows during sunny winter days. By 1845, county agricultural reports listed floor heating systems among the recommended improvements for frontier homesteads, alongside root cellars and stock ponds. The method that had once made Jensen a target of mockery had become part of the standard knowledge that experienced settlers passed to newcomers. Extension agents carried technical diagrams and installation guides, ensuring that the technique could be replicated safely and effectively across the expanding frontier. The vindication was complete when the territorial legislature commissioned a study of heating efficiency in frontier buildings, seeking ways to reduce deforestation around growing settlements. The official report, published in 1847, identified thermal mass floor heating as the most fuel-efficient heating method available to frontier families, capable of reducing wood consumption by 50 to 60% while maintaining superior comfort and safety. Jensen's buried fire had become government policy. The legacy extended beyond mere heating efficiency. Settlers who mastered thermal mass principles began applying similar techniques to food preservation, using heated stone beds to maintain root cellars at optimal temperatures through the winter. Blacksmiths adapted the coal removal and heat storage methods to improve forge efficiency. Even military engineers studied the systems for heating frontier forts and supply depots where fuel delivery was uncertain. On the frontier, the surest heat was the heat you stored, and the old ways stored it best. Jensen's experiment with buried fire had rediscovered a principle that human beings had known wherever winters were long and fuel was precious. The thermal mass could stretch fire energy across time, providing steady warmth long after the flames died. What had seemed like madness became wisdom, and what had been dismissed as primitive became the foundation of frontier survival.